By 2011, the UFC had shaken its toxic reputation to become the fastest-growing business in world sports, and leading one of America's biggest broadcasters to take a chance on the promotion. Today, we look at one of the biggest and most important deals in UFC history, and how the company's quest for mainstream legitimacy triggered many of the issues felt by fans to this day. Welcome to the INC, and today we ask, did the UFC flop on Fox? Before looking at the UFC Fox deal, it's important to understand the company's history on television. For much of its modern tenure, the UFC was synonymous with Spike TV. The male lifestyle channel broadcast the first season of The Ultimate Fighter in 2005, and the show's breakout success led to the UFC experimenting with televised fight cards. The first UFC fight night took place on August 6th that year. Nate Marquardt defeated Ivan Salivary in the main event, while The Ultimate Fighter veterans Stephen Bonner, Chris Lieben, and Kenny Florian featured on the show's undercard. By 2010, the UFC Spike deal had blossomed into an almost umbilical connection. 14 seasons of The Ultimate Fighter, along with monthly fight nights across Spike and its sister channels, as well as several compilation and panel shows scattered throughout its schedule. Rising stars, including future company flag bearer Jon Jones, would use these fight nights as their first step towards MMA stardom. The UFC's connection with Spike TV seemed like a fruitful one, but UFC President Dana White believed a bigger broadcast partner was needed to take the company to the next level. There had been several attempts to coax the UFC away from Spike. In a recent interview, White revealed he and UFC owner Lorenzo Fertitta rejected an offer from CBS to purchase the company outright. While a deal with HBO fell through after White grew concerned the broadcaster wanted too much say on the show's production. The deal that turned the boss's head, however, came from Fox, who had been looking for a sports package to attract its lucrative 18 to 34-year-old market. In August of 2011, the UFC announced a 7-year broadcasting agreement estimated to be worth $100 million annually, more than double of what the company was earning with Spike. The deal would see the UFC host 32 events across Fox-affiliated channels, including 4 on Fox itself, marking the first time the UFC had been broadcast live on terrestrial television. Fox Sports chairman David Hill was confident of what the agreement could offer for both parties.
I can't emphasize how thrilled we are to have got this deal done. And the only thing I really want to say is if you look where Frank and Lorenzo and Dana have taken this sport, and literally it's that smaller group, and that's the brains trust that have made it work in the last decade. Imagine what's going to happen in the next decade. I really think the growth and the potential of this is explosive.
Fox had experimented with MMA in the past. UFC fighters had been regular guests on the company's Best Damn Sports show in the early 2000s, while its affiliate channel, My Network TV, was home to the ill-fated International Fight League. The UFC formally announced the deal during a televised press conference a few days later. But what would have been the first experience of MMA for several million viewers became one of the cringiest broadcasts in television history.
Also joining us today from the UFC are former UFC champion Rashad Evans, UFC Hall of Famer Chuck Liddell, UFC lightweight champion Frankie Edgar, and UFC welterweight champion George St. Pierre.
Fox hosted its first UFC event in November 2011, with Cain Velasquez defending his heavyweight title against #1 contender Junior Dos Santos. It didn't take long for Fox to flex its muscles. While the show in Anaheim boasted a 10-fight undercard, Fox chose to dedicate its 1-hour broadcast solely to the main event. It took just over a minute for the company to rue its mistake. The broadcast was a mixed blessing for the UFC. While the show broke the record as the most watched card in MMA history, many were left unsatisfied by the main event's premature ending, with Fox dedicating its broadcast to just 64 seconds of action. Fox's head-scratching decision to prioritize the main event was made even more jarring by the undercard, including a lightweight title eliminator between Benson Henderson and Clay Guida. The match was voted one of the best of 2011, but was only shown in retroactive broadcasts of the event. The major network learned from their mistake in the following shows. expanding their broadcasting window to 4 fights and showcasing a healthy mix of stars and number 1 contenders, including a run of 5 straight cards headlined by title fights. The first of these came in December of 2012, when a now champion Benson Henderson took on Nate Diaz at Fight Night Seattle. Henderson claimed a comfortable win over the Stockton fighter, but his triumph was overshadowed by another champion in the pre-fight press conference.
I'm going to make it official right now, the first ever UFC Women's Champion, Ronda Rousey. And I'm presenting her with her belt. And I'm announcing her fight.
Many cite the Fox deal as a key factor in Rousey signing for the promotion. The increased number of fight cards meant the UFC needed to expand its roster, and attempted to solve the issue by introducing its first ever women's division. Women's bouts would be a fixture of Fox cards through the company's tenure, with quarter-hour breakdowns suggesting the fights were some of the most watched on each broadcast. Another class to benefit from Fox was flyweight. The division was developed explicitly with the Fox deal in mind, with Demetrius Johnson's first 3 title defenses hosted on the channel. Johnson, however, failed to connect with a largely casual audience, and the TV exclusive idea was dropped by the time he faced Ali Bagautinov at UFC 174. Initially, the Fox deal seemed like a success. 4 of its first 6 events pulled over 4 million viewers, and audiences seemingly accepted the once blacklisted sport as a mainstream product. Something helped by Fox handling pre- and post-fight production of each card. It didn't take long, however, for the honeymoon to end. While the UFC made a conscious attempt to expand its roster, many fans accused the company of watering down their cards to accommodate the larger number of events. UFC 149, airing 6 months after the Fox deal, was beset with injuries in the weeks before the show, with the end product regarded as one of the worst pay-per-views in company history. UFC 151, meanwhile, didn't happen at all. A title match between John Jones and Dan Henderson was cancelled after Henderson withdrew from the bout, claiming an injury 8 days before the event. And when Jones turned down a short-notice replacement of Chael Sonnen, the UFC decided to axe the card rather than proceed with the remaining bouts. Over the next 3 years, the UFC-Fox partnership was at best an amicable one. Ratings remained around the 3 million mark for each broadcast, and while the company drifted away from showcasing title fights, it still provided a pedestal for rising stars and number 1 contenders, all in a tidy 2-hour window for incoming audiences. The deal also helped the UFC expand its global reach, as Fox's associate channel FS1 became the unofficial home of the company's international cards, including their first events in Sweden, South Korea, and the Netherlands. By this point, the UFC machine was a well-oiled juggernaut. It was how hard it was working that was problematic. By 2014, the UFC played host to 46 events across Fox and pay-per-view, along with 2 seasons of The Ultimate Fighter, 4 international versions, and several magazine and compilation shows. The oversaturation started to impact TV audiences. Fox cards dropped to the low 2 million mark, and the watering down arguments that plagued its pay-per-views were also felt on the silver screen. The UFC were forced into a new direction if they wanted to justify the Fox deal, a more crass and less credible direction. As the UFC entered the Reebok era, their approach to Fox cards became more tabloid. Rather than showcasing champions or number 1 contenders, Fox shows gave a pedestal to fighters with huge social media followings, hoping their extracurricular activities would translate to higher viewer numbers. This was best seen in December of 2016, when a match between Paige Van Zandt and Michelle Waterson served as the main event of Fight Night Sacramento, a card which also featured tabloid favorites Sage Northcutt, Mickey Gall, and Mike Perry. Despite the new direction, Fox cards still managed to unearth fresh talent. Valentina Shevchenko was a comparative unknown when she made her UFC debut in 2015, but 3 straight Fox wins, including a title eliminator with Juliana Pena, turned her into one of the sport's biggest female stars. Shevchenko's rise was nothing compared to Nate Diaz. After his failed title bid in 2012, Diaz had fallen into the mid-card by the time he faced Michael Johnson at Fight Night Orlando. Diaz would win a back-and-forth clash by unanimous decision, but it's what happened after the fight which stole all the headlines.
Conor McGregor, you're taking everything I work for, I'm gonna fight your
While the call-out was dismissed as typical Diaz bravado, it stayed in the mind of the 2.8 million viewers who watched the event, And when McGregor needed an opponent for UFC 186, Diaz was drafted into the match on 2 weeks' notice, claiming a second-round submission and propelling the Californian to superstardom. The rise of Diaz and Shevchenko, however, were an anomaly. Dustin Poirier's win over Eddie Alvarez at Fight Night Calgary broke the record as the worst drawing card in Fox history, despite an undercard including former champions Jose Aldo and Joanna Jędrzejczyk. The ratings proved a key factor when it came to contract negotiations. Fox had originally planned to split its cards alongside rival blockbuster ESPN, but balked when the UFC requested double its fee for the deal. In the end, ESPN decided to proceed on its own, agreeing to a 5-year contract estimated at $1.5 billion. Fox's final card came in December of 2018, with Ally Akinta defeating Kevin Lee in the main event of Fight Night Milwaukee. The UFC began its ESPN deal the following month, while Fox used the money saved to secure a contract with the WWE. The Fox deal was a blessing and a curse for the UFC. It helped raise the company's profile both domestically and internationally, as well as providing the financial backbone for its expansion in the 2010s. In doing so, however, it raised concerns of oversaturation and the watering down of fight cards, criticism still leveled by modern fans of the sport. The Fox deal remains one of the biggest landmarks in the UFC's still short history, with the rise of streaming and their ESPN deal up for renewal next year. The next chapter of the sport on television could be a fascinating one. This is the INC. Please like, share, and subscribe. Post your feedback in the comments and donate to our Patreon page for more exclusive content.